I'm always looking for ways to show my cat how much I love her. And with Fancy Feast gems, I can pamper her whenever I want with a savory gravy on top of a gourmet mousse pâté. The pyramid shape makes serving simple, so all I have to do is peel and plate to make mealtime feel extra fancy. And with 2 entrees in every pack, it's easy to turn every day into the extraordinary. Fancy Feast gems.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
The McDonald's snack wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch snack wrap. Spicy snack wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. I first encountered the work of S.J. Naudé when a South African friend of mine passed me his debut collection of short stories, The Alphabet of Birds. I was so taken with the stories, which Naudé had translated himself from the Afrikaans, each of which felt more uniquely alive than the last, that I sought him out for our literary festival, making him the first, though not the last, South African to grace the New Voices Festival. Those stories have been followed by a novel, The Third Reel, and another collection, Mad Honey. The things I like best about Naudé's fiction, his play with unexpected forms of narrative, his queering of the landscape of South African and European literary landscapes, and his determined interest in how new forms of community can be forged in difficult times, are on display in his latest novel, Fathers and Fugitives. The novel comes to us in 5 chapters that largely center on the South African Daniel, gay and well-off living in London, dealing with the death of his tyrannical father who has left him an inheritance with a caveat. He must visit his cousin Theon in the countryside of South Africa for a month to reconnect after many years. Daniel makes the journey unwillingly, only to find that their estrangement has caused Theon a great deal of anger and upset since their childhood. What follows is an entangling of their lives in unexpected and dramatic ways. A journey to Japan to treat a young child in Theon's kinship circle, a reimagining of the inheritance as an investment in Theon's farm, and a return of Daniel to the heartland to live in a domestic arrangement with his cousin. Amazingly, this story is bracketed by 2 others that appear loosely and then quite tightly connected to the central plot. The story of 2 down-on-their-luck and rather devious Serbs who inveigle themselves into Daniel's life, and a different kind of entrance by a young man into Daniel and Theon's lives in the twilight of their season together. Taken as a singular work, the pieces merge and mesh with electric energy and Naudé's signature play with language. This is a novel of hauntings as much as inheritances, and tonally it moves with pace through suspense, tragedy, global adventure, and the desperate search for community. S.J. Naudé is the author of 2 collections of short stories and 2 novels. He is the winner of the Nadine Gordimer Short Story Award, the University of Johannesburg Prize, and the Kyknet Rapport Prize, and is the only writer to win the Herzog Prize twice consecutively in its 100-year history. His first novel, The Third Reel, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Prize. His work has been published in Granta and other journals in the US, UK, the Netherlands, and Italy. He spent nearly half his life as a corporate lawyer in London and is now a full-time writer in South Africa. welcome to the show, S.J. Naudé.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'll be referring to you as Funny during the recording, and I think I'll start us off with a question about the structure of Fathers and Fugitives. When I think about the structure of Fathers and Fugitives, I think about a novel in parts, something between a set of linked stories and a novel with boundaries of times and place between its sections. How would you describe its structure, and how do you see that structure conveying something about its plot?
Sure. Yes, I would certainly think of it as a novel, but indeed a novel with some hybridic qualities. The novel, as you point out, consists of 5 parts. 4 of them could probably be read as standalone stories. The 5th is, I think, more in the nature of an epilogue that binds the novel together. But yes, it focuses on a single protagonist and indeed covers the entire more or less latter half of his life. But I've always resisted a kind of binary approach to short versus the short versus the long form. I always prefer to think of it as a continuum with, perhaps the epic novel on the one end and the single sentence short story at the other end, with a great variety of possibilities in between. And I like to move along that continuum. Even when I've written collections of short stories, they, would often have a level of connection or relate to each other in various ways. Stories can, of course, mirror or echo each other or undermine or destabilize each other or rub up against each other like tectonic plates. And different chronologies can achieve different effects as well. But then I don't want to claim, exceptionalism or radical exception South African stories or South African society. But it is also the case, I think, well, in my experience, that the competing truths of South African social and cultural and political realities, the complexity of it, the fragmentation of it, seems to often demand, deviations from conventional form. And it's almost sometimes as if the material itself pushes the story into new forms or shatters the form, as it were. So I think a combination of all these factors, also the fact that I'm temperamentally quite attracted to the longer short form stories that might not be conventional modern short stories, some pieces that might feel more like novellas almost, or like compressed novels sometimes. So I think all these factors taken together pushes me to be adventurous, if that's the word, with form and with combining short and long forms. And there is something episodic, I guess, about this book, but ultimately it hopefully has the shape of a novel.
I just love that description of how the moment in South Africa demands a kind of a new form, a fragmented form. I've always believed that nations and cultures and societies in moments of great change and upheaval look for new forms to contrast old forms and also to reflect the way people are feeling and responding to what can be chaotic experiences of that change. And I think you've put a real razor point on that.
I mean, I absolutely agree. And I think often those kinds of societies, as a result, produce quite interesting, quite pioneering literature, that might often only be visible in retrospect, but yes.
The first section of the novel, Where Wolves Mate, develops an energy that is anxious and mysterious. 2 Serb nationals show up in England and attach themselves to Daniel, leeching off him while also becoming his loose sexual partners. This relationship, if that's even the word, will lead to a horrible tragedy when Daniel visits the 2 later on. They might indeed be war criminals or simply deeply impoverished and hopeless, but the novel makes us feel this centerpiece is the centerpiece of the plot until it isn't. I wonder if it was fun to pull the rug out from under the reader in this way, And can you help us think about how you see this section in relation to the others from the authorial perspective?
Yes, the first section, as I mentioned, did start out life as a separate story. The second section of then started out life as a companion piece to that first story. And then it grew into essentially an account of not only the second half of the life of Daniel, my protagonist, but also his interesting and somewhat amorphous or hard to read relationship with his cousin Theon, and how that develops throughout the rest of their lives. And the novel is, as mentioned, unconventional in form. It is also, because of that, I think I allowed myself the freedom to, although the stories follow chronologically upon each other, to have periods of time in between these stories or these sections of the novel. The first three parts are only a year or so apart. The fourth part then occurs about 12 years later, and the last part occurs about 18 years after the fourth part. So the time gaps grow and grow. And as a result, there is, I think, some freedom, or I allowed myself some freedom to, plot-wise, also play with certain deviations. There's chronology, there's hopefully unity as well. But at the same time, this kind of structure allows one not only the leeway to allow for some tonal differences between the different parts of the stories, but then also some, somewhat circuitous routes plot-wise to get to the next piece or the next chapter.
I think the thing that I experienced most directly was the tonal shift, even though there's a chronology that's very much linked in a kind of obvious and evident way. That tone, which becomes more and more tense, and especially when they're in that camping area and they encounter the other Serbian, and it seems like maybe there's going to be some sort of attack or something bad is going to happen. And of course, bad things do happen, but very different from what actually does happen. And that tone is so different from the rest of the novel, and I really liked that. I liked the friction of tone there.
Sure. I think there are perhaps slightly more subtle shifts of tone as one moves from the second to the third to the fourth and the final part.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I guess one ends up with a far more elegiac tone towards the end of the novel. But that is, I would hope, also linked to the development of Daniel as a character. He does age significant. By the end of the book, he's an old man. So I think in part the tone might also reflect the shifting psychology of Daniel as he becomes older.
So I see this novel as being in part about the lines of connection between people, both lines of blood kinship, obviously as enacted by the inheritance, but also linkages of connection that are random but become meaningful. Hein, who's this very interesting kind of almost addendum to the character lineup of the novel, will ultimately use an analogy of holding a baby's hand as a universal yearning for human linkage. Is that something you see yourself exploring in the novel? And do you feel like there is something like a universal striving for this kind of linkage?
The novel is certainly about, in its most ordinary terms, when a search for human connection, apart from the characters attempting all kinds of different fatherhood. But there's also a broader search for connection. Unfortunately, those connections tend to be failed connections turn out to be failed connections towards the end of the novel. I would take what Hein, the character you mentioned, who is also the narrator of the fourth section. It's the only section of the novel that is not narrated from a sort of a narrow, close third-person perspective from the angle of Daniel. I would certainly be careful of attaching too much weight to the views of Hein, who's something of a drifter, something of a, his thoughts are not particularly coherent. They are somewhat new age banal. And so he might be voicing something that is being explored in the novel, but at the same time, he is not someone through whom I would necessarily want to voice any elements of core meaning in the novel. The shift to Hein's perspective, I should perhaps mention, is, I guess it has two functions. In the first place, because of this specific perspective, one follows Daniel's perspective very narrowly. At the same time, one doesn't get much access to his internal world or his interior world. His thoughts are largely opaque. So it's quite a claustrophobic perspective, and intentionally so. But I think I needed in that section to provide a perspective on the relationship between Daniel and Theon, which it was difficult to otherwise convey with such clarity. And at the same time, I think Hein is also the only exclusively non-queer, the only exclusively heterosexual character in the novel. And I thought it was also important to switch to that perspective in order to contrast that with that of the other characters.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
What does every USAA member have in common? Family. We're one big family who supports the military community and their eligible families. And if you, your parent, or spouse served, you could join our family and save big on auto insurance. Visit USAA.com/join today to check your eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
I mean, it's interesting that you say to get clarity on Daniel and Theon's relationship, because one of the things I like is that it still, even in Hein's narrative perspective, is very unclear what their relationship is. I want to think of it as queering a domestic relationship, but it is, I mean, that's such a complicated term for it. They are living, cohabitating domestically. There's a sense of kind of fathering for this whole area that the two of them are doing. And yet in many ways, it defies the notion of queerness. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the unclarity or the lack of clarity in their relationship.
Yes, clarity might not be the best way. I guess Hein provides some clarity about the lack of clarity in that relationship.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And yes, I wanted to keep that, rather amorphous, the extent to which that relationship is platonic or not, exactly what the content of it is. Both these characters are adrift and alone in many ways. I was interested in the case of Daniel in particular, who lived this, who previously lived a cosmopolitan life with its attendant drift. I was quite interested in somewhat perversely re-parochializing him, driving him back to South Africa, into the desolate hinterland of South Africa, and seeing what the logical conclusion of that might be. He's certainly someone who has complicated thoughts about where he belongs, about his identity, his national identity, his sexual identity. His sexual identity is presumably the one thing that's reasonably sorted out, but one which is certainly at odds with the world in which he grew up. Both these characters, Theon and Daniel, grew up at the height of the apartheid era in South Africa, or the late apartheid, I guess, but still apartheid before its demise. And the one character, then Theon, had spent his entire life in this remote place with a rather domineering father. Daniel had fled his father as a fugitive, as it were, but the two of them get together, and the question is then, how does these different approaches to embedment and belonging or not belonging in this country and in this landscape play out in that relationship. And I think it's difficult to know exactly what the content of that relationship is, but whatever those preoccupations with belonging might be, they hold these two together in some sort of uncomfortable union.
The sort of grounding and rooting that you do with Daniel made me think about the genre of the Platzroman and the thinking about the idealizing of the farm and the return to the farm as a place of kind of centrality in South African domestic life. But it felt very much like you wanted to play with and distort that form, to in some ways return to it, but by having it be Daniel and Theon and not who we would typically see in the farm space, that you were trying to do something different with the Platzroman. Was that in your mind as you were thinking about other South African novels and maybe wanting to play with or distort it?
I can't say that it was a very conscious effort at writing a Platzroman or a destabilized Platzroman or an anti-Platzroman. The farm novel has a very long history, a long tradition in South Africa from the 1930s onwards. Having said that, I think there's an even longer tradition from the 60s onwards of novels undermining the conventions and the traditions of that kind of novel.
True.
Initially, the farm novel was really, farm novels used to give an account of white farmers in South Africa, no longer European, but not yet African, about their relationship with the land, about inheritance, protecting ownership of the land. The boys or young men would inherit. It's a kind of a feudal and patriarchal system. Women are subservient, black farm laborers would blend into the background. And then from the 60s onwards, novels started to subvert those approaches, and they would often provide a microcosm of the radical social changes that have been going on over the last few decades. I think this novel...
I think of the conservationist, Gordimer's famous devastation of the Platzroman.
Absolutely. And there are also more recent examples. There's Marlene van Niekerk's Heart, or published in the UK as The Way of the Women. There is even Damon Galgut's Booker Prize winning The Promise, plays on the farm novel.
Absolutely.
So there are ways in which my novel can fall within the category of the anti-farm novel, if you want to call it that. But I think elsewhere I've mentioned, I think one could probably think of it as 21st century queer anti-farm novel that tries to collapse the boundary between the global and the hyper-local, if that's not a mouthful. Yeah. So it is in that tradition, and it isn't.
So one of the sections of the novel that I'm most drawn to is hankai, which means condemned in Japanese. And it's a term used in that section by a Japanese doctor to describe his home after the 2011 tsunami. But he also sees himself as partly condemned, hollowed out by the death of his family. And this term is then loosely applied to Theon after the death of Mutlale. And it can certainly be understood as a way to see the fates of the characters to be partially condemned and left with the task of rebuilding. Tell us about hankai, how you encountered it as a word, and what is it doing here in Fathers and Fugitives?
Sure. To be perfectly honest with you, I can't remember exactly where I encountered it, but certainly on a trip to Tokyo a number of years ago. It's normally applied to building, and in that context, the best equivalent, as you say, is the English word condemned. It also could be translated, I believe, as half destroyed or half ruined.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I think the characters, for various reasons, my two protagonists, or the protagonist Daniel and his cousin, are half destroyed or condemned in a sense, and in large part because of the nature of their relationship with their fathers. And I think the the kind of part of the process of healing that they pursue is this process of attempting their own fatherhood. They try to be fathers on two occasions to children. The fact that it ultimately fails is hopefully perhaps beside the point. I think their efforts, their attempts to redesign and give new shape to fatherhood, in a country where one should ask, I guess, whether one can be a good father to a son in the face of such a history of social and political brutality.
Mm. That's quite the statement. Do you want to say more about that?
Well, I think masculinity in this society historically, and to a large degree today, has often been associated with things like dominance, physical prowess, even violence, authoritarian behavior. And I think what the book wants to explore to some degree is at least in these efforts, these nascent efforts at fatherhood, what other kinds of fatherhood might be possible and might change this country, frankly, from the inside out. The idea that instead of teaching one's son how to kick a ball, shouldn't one focus on teaching male children gentleness and empathy and ethical instincts, and how to be a good partner and a good citizen, all those kinds of things. As I say, the book might not seem too hopeful on that front, given that the attempts of Daniel and Theon don't work out in both cases. But
but what could one say that they father each other, and then that is quite successful?
Perhaps, yes. I think there's an attempt to make up for the lack of experience of being fathered in both directions. So there's some hope on that front. I've in an interview a while ago, someone suggested that they find my books somewhat pessimistic, but I've never quite. One isn't always the best judge of your own work, but I've never quite thought of my own work in that way. I think since I called them sort of sneakily utopian, my stories.
Like that.
I think below the surface somewhere lies a kind of photo negative of the world that is depicted. Photo negative that is, or maybe this world is the photo negative of the world that lies just beyond what is being depicted. And that world is one in which I think one imagines different kind of possibilities in terms of human relationships and human connection. World where words that might seem naive in social world in which I exist, at least, notions of generosity and empathy. And there's a very good Afrikaans word, which is very hard to translate, which is medemenselijkheid, which means fellow humanness. And there's also an African version, Ubuntu, which is essentially...
Yes, Ubuntu is, I'm familiar with.
I'm sure you are, and that is meant to be very much a value of the new South Africa, underlying even judicial decisions in South Africa and approaches. So and Ubuntu means essentially being a human amongst other humans. So yes, so I think the pessimistic elements that my stories may sometimes seem to focus on is something that is in the foreground, and that like small hills in a landscape where if you wipe them away, there would be a new world lying beyond it. So yes, and often I think there's a thin membrane between the world that's being depicted and something. It isn't. It's my sense is often it's topographically very close. It isn't such a long distance to that other world. But first, this one has to be addressed.
The movement to the narrative, which you wonderfully described earlier as somewhere between globality and, I believe you said, rootedness. And the movement from, the UK to Europe and then Japan and South Africa does seem to engage globality, even as the heart of the novel feels very rooted in South Africa. And I'm using that phrasing very purposefully to invoke Kutsia there. That global movement is then matched by the movement through the lives of the different sets of principal characters. The Serbs, and then Theon, and then very suddenly Hein, who for a moment takes over as the focal character and narrator during his ill-conceived taking of a child whose parents have died. What is the globality doing to the way in which the novel moves through the lives of characters? And you talked a little bit about Hein, but can you talk about him as an interesting intermediary figure in that rooted/global pull?
Sure. On a very personal level, I spent a lot of half of my adult life in the Northern Hemisphere, having grown up in South Africa. So where I think, as you pointed out at the beginning, I was a corporate lawyer, no less, for those years.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtual Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your virtual pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
So my own sense was certainly of having been uprooted from the place where I grew up. I lived in the US and I lived in the UK, and I tended to travel a lot for work. And then I returned to South Africa to write here and to make a life here again at a time when I had really no links here anymore. So my books often tend to, I don't think I've ever written a story or a novel that is set in a single country. And maybe there's a certain sense of not knowing one place quite well enough to set an entire book there. So I guess that's the personal subtext.
Mm-hmm.
With Daniel, as I think I've also alluded to earlier, who lives a sort of a cosmopolitan, rather drifting life in the Northern Hemisphere. In a sense, the experiment from a narrative perspective was to take him and re-parochialize him and force him back into this world of his youth, and then see what happens. And his cousin, who is someone who's very constrained by that world, which he's never left, and then see what happens between those two men. And Hein is a young South African man who goes and stays with Daniel and Theon on the farm. And he's a kind of even though he's a local, he's also a South African who's always been in the country. But he's something of a drifter as well. He's someone who travels around in South Africa, who plays in rock bands and makes leather sandals and flogs them at music festivals, and has sort of half-baked new agey ideas about enlightenment, personal enlightenment. So he is, as you say, something of an in-between figure, perhaps, rooted but not rooted.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's how I absolutely saw him, despite the fact that he's not traveling in the cosmopolitan way that Daniel is. He still has this kind of, as you say, he's mobile and unrooted and unanchored in a way that I think that it's very important that he then situates himself in Daniel and Theon's home.
Yes. Although then his impulse to float and to move off again then actually is the catalyst for the the most difficult part of the plot towards the end.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I don't want to spoil anything, but there are multiple quite difficult moments in the novel that are powerful and that stay with one as a reader. But the end one is quite powerful. We must, of course, discuss inheritance in Fathers and Fugitives. The stipulation of Daniel's inheritance is that he must come and live with Theon for a month to receive the money. And that's the most direct application we have to this idea of inheritance, but it is a novel full of inheritances. Wealth, poverty, farms, sickness, guilt, complicity. What are some of the ways that you see inheritance operating beyond just the mere passage of wealth from one family to another?
So South Africa, with its well-known history, has the problem of inheritance, as you point out, the kind of privileges, the kind of divides, the kind of inequalities that have been with us, and that, quite sadly, within the democratic era, have not been resolved. In fact, in terms of wealth, certainly, that wealth equality has worsened and increased. So I think the book does try to grapple with that inheritance, and Daniel, without, not perhaps in a very coherent way, but an intuitive way, is trying to find his way to, knowing what to do with that inheritance. Both, I think, of course, on the practical level of the money he inherits from his father, but also the concrete level, but also the metaphorical level of, what does one do with privilege, to use the most commonly applied word. And it isn't a simple question as how does one give up privilege, especially in terms of knowledge and experience and the extent to which privilege is located in those realms. He does, perhaps in a slightly half-hearted and perhaps in a slightly unsophisticated way, try, I think, to do something with that inheritance of money, other than just make his own life more comfortable. He does give some of it to his cousin. They give the farm away to the former laborers of Theon and his father on the farm. So I think there are small steps that he takes to do something with that inheritance, to dissipate it or to channel it in meaningful directions, but it's only a very early start and quite hesitant.
Before I let you go, I'd love very much to know what you've been reading and loving recently, and whether you have some things that you think my listeners might find great recommendations.
I often don't read books just when they come out. I am often put off, I think, by the hyperbole and noise that goes along with publication. So I'm always a year or two behind, but some of the interesting books I've read in recent times were a novel called The Whale Tattoo by a young British author called John Ransom, which focuses on a queer boy in a fishing village in Norfolk in the UK, a very sensual, very beautifully written book. He's actually written another one since. Another one, an author that's well known by now in the US, is Brandon Taylor, whose work I've been a fan of since his debut, Real Life. And I've just read his second book, Filthy Beasts, which I also found short stories that I also found but connected short stories that I also found wonderful. He's also had another one out since. And then my own compatriot, although he now lives in Australia, J.M. Coetzee. I've not always been the greatest fan of some of his late work, but his most recent book, The Pole and Other Stories, which is a novella plus a few short stories, is really quite.
Oh, we only have it in the U.S. as The Pole. No attending short stories.
Oh, I see. No, I see. Is it published only? Is the novella published on its own?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I see. In the UK and the South African versions, there are a few Elizabeth Costello stories, new Elizabeth Costello stories, and then one story.
Wow. Oh, well, that's very. I'm mad that I don't get those.
Yes, I think one or two of them have appeared elsewhere in journals or so, but yes, no, some of them are brand new, and there's a very short new story right at the end, which is not an Elizabeth Costello story. So you should get your version from another continent.
Yeah, I guess so. I have not heard of the whale tattoo, but it sounds wonderful. And I definitely recommend the interview that happened on Novel Dialogue, which is the other show that I am a producer on with Brandon Taylor, because he is one of the best interviewees I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And if you just look for Novel Dialogue and Brandon Taylor, and I'll link to it on our webpage, but he's just a phenomenal conversationalist.
I would love to hear that. I find his work extremely interesting. Not quite like anything else I know.
Me too. And I just, he's a remarkable person. Well, Fanny, I just can't thank you enough for coming on to talk about Fathers and Fugitives. I mentioned at the beginning how much I adore The Alphabet of Birds, and I really do love this novel. I've seen the reviews it's been getting, and I am not alone in giving it high praise. So I hope you won't mind the hyperbole from my side of things to say that I think people should run out and grab the really beautiful edition from Europa of Fathers and Fugitives. And thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really enjoyed our talk.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to my friend S.J. Naudé for coming on to talk about his latest novel, Fathers and Fugitives. You can find links to purchase Fathers and Fugitives and all of S.J.'s recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.